Hello and welcome to our lesson on the reform movements. I just want to start with this slide here. This is inquiry 3, the third inquiry of our 3 for paper 2. And to remind you of the big question. The big question is, how powerful did the people become? The people is obviously a vague phrase, and we need to be clear on what we mean by the people when we use that in our writing. And I think the other thing we want to be thinking about is, well, if we're talking about powerful, what does it mean to be powerful? What powers are being gained? What powers are being lost? And finally, and this is a question that's going to emerge later on, not in today's lesson, but how powerful do the government become? So where does power go? If the government become powerful, do the people lose power? These are questions we're going to be looking at. But first things first, let's get to today's title. Today's title is, which Reform Act most significantly altered the political nation? And the political nation and those in power within the political nation were very fearful of a revolution, very fearful of, to use this print, very famous print from 1906, of the ceiling falling in, or the floor falling in for the ruling class, and the ceiling breaking in for the working class. The revolution of pulling apart the system and re-altering it radically, we've seen before, for instance, during the English Civil War, was something that the political nation were very fearful of. And so many within the political nation believed that reform was the way to go. If we see gradual changes, we don't lose the system and the power we have within the system if we allow for gradual changes. And that's really part of today's lesson. But as part of that reform, we have multiple reform acts, changes which gave new rights to new members of the political nation, and got rid of certain old elements of the old political nation. So today's lesson, we're going to be analysing which reform acts were most significantly altered, or which reform acts most significantly altered that political nation. Okay, so you should have a sheet that looks somewhat like this in front of you. And hopefully last lesson you went through this and you tried your best. What I'm going to try and do today is clarify some of those points. We've already done the first Reform Act, known as sometimes the Great Reform Act of 1832. So we're going to begin with the Second Reform Act. The Second Reform Act, you can see here details of. Now, you may want to pause it here and copy in some of the details if you haven't got them already, and see if you can fill in gaps. Just to be clear on that, the Second Reform Act was passed in 1867. It was passed by a Tory, a Conservative Prime Minister by the name of Benjamin Disraeli. This despite the fact that he was a Conservative, which shows you that some people in power were willing to offer reform in aid of not experiencing a revolution. Another 45 small constituencies lost their own MPs. These weren't now rotten boroughs, but they were smaller constituencies, and these seats were given to the towns and the counties with larger populations. As part of industrialisation, where people were moving to those larger towns, they started to get more MPs. And we see Manchester getting multiple MPs. We see London getting more MPs as well. In the boroughs, all men who owned or rented a house could vote. This was mainly for the better off working classes, the supposedly responsible working classes. They didn't want to give the vote yet to the irresponsible working classes, or the working classes who were far poorer, because they were seen as being more revolutionary and in demand of more change. Whereas this better off class of working class people, the slightly better paid people who could rent a house at a high price or even own one, these were the people who were given the vote, and it was men, not women. In the counties, men who owned or leased land could vote. So if you owned some land in places that were rural, or you rented land out, you could actually be able to vote as long as you were a man. And this therefore doubled the size of the electorate from 20% roughly, the 18 to 20% that were given the vote in the 1832 Reform Act, to 40% of the male population. Okay, those without the vote were either agricultural labourers or unskilled industrial workers in factories, 60% of the men couldn't vote, or the 100% of the people that still couldn't vote were the women, who still had not been given the right to vote, despite at this point some activism demanding it. The third Reform Act comes in 1884, and this was passed by the Liberals now under a Prime Minister called William Gladstone. This gave the vote to respectable male working classes, and particularly to the householder, i.e. the head of the household in the countryside, the equivalent of the men who had gained the votes in the towns in 1867. It gave yet more seats to the big towns and cities, so as part of industrialisation, as more people moved to the cities, more MPs were given to those places, and the electorate, because of this, rose from 3 to 5 million. For the first time, the constituencies were represented fairly, with a rough kind of even spread of around about 50,000 constituents per MP. So we see the increase in the voting population, but still no votes for women, and still some men who are landless, who don't own any property, not being given the right to vote. And that brings us to the last of the Reform Acts, actually not referred to as a Reform Act at all. It's called the Representation of the People Act, 1918. This was passed by the Liberal David Lloyd George, Prime Minister, after World War I. It gave the vote to all men, regardless of whether they own property, over the age of 21. It gave the vote to women who were over the age of 30 if they were a property owner or married to a male voter. So either if you were married or if you owned your own property and were single as a woman, you could vote, but only if you were over the age of 30. The government needed to pass it in response to an unprecedented amount of slaughter during World War I, with millions of men, particularly working class men who had gone off to fight and died during the World War, as well as women's work at home who were filling in for the men who were out fighting on the front. And it was seen as a kind of fair sacrifice, or sort of fair kind of payment for the sacrifices of those people. This increased the amount of men who could vote to 12.9 million, effectively 100% of the male population, with a few exceptions. And female electorate of 8.5 million was created. Still many millions who weren't, particularly women who weren't married, or women who were also women who didn't own property and weren't married, or women who were married but who weren't married but did own property, to clarify. This increased the amount of women who could vote to 8.5 million, but the people women who still couldn't vote were women under 30 who didn't own property, and who were not married. Working class votes became more important ever, and this really has an impact upon working class movements, particularly the Labour Party, who become vastly more popular within the electorate because they have a greater number of working class voters who are keen to vote for them. So those are our acts, but this doesn't tell the whole story. What we want to be asking in these acts is, well, which of these was the most significant change or alteration to the political nation? And to think about this, it's worth considering. First off,
Well, Mrs. Miggins, at last we can return to sanity. The hustings are over, the bunting is down, the mad hysteria is at an end. After the chaos of a general election, we can return to normal.
Well, has there been a general election then, Mr. Blackadder?
Indeed there has, Mrs. Miggins.
Well, I never heard about it.
Well, of course you didn't. You're not eligible to vote.
Well, why not?
Because virtually no one is. Women, peasants, chimpanzees, lunatics, lords.
That's not true. Lord Nelson's got a vote.
He's got a boat, Baldwin. Marvellous thing, democracy. Look at Manchester. Population 60,000, electoral roll 3.
I may have a brain the size of a sultana.
Correct.
But it hardly seems fair to me.
Well, of course it's not fair. And a damn good thing, too. Give the like of Baldrick the vote, and we'll be back to cavorting druids, death by stoning, and dung for dinner.
I'm having dung for dinner tonight.
So, who are they electing when they have these elections?
Oh, the same old shower. Fat Tory landowners who get made MPs when they reach a certain weight. Raving revolutionaries who think that just because they do a day's work, that somehow gives them the right to get paid. Basically, it's a right old mess. Toffs at the top, plebs at the bottom, and me in the middle making a fat pile of cash out of both of them.
Well, you've got to watch out, Mr. Blackadder. Things are bound to change.
Not while Pitt the Elder's Prime Minister, they aren't. He's about as effective as a cat flap in an elephant house. As long as his feet are warm and he gets a nice cup of milky tea in the sun before his morning nap, he doesn't bother anyone until his potty needs emptying.
Who was introduced to the political nation in the 1832 Reform Act? If these are our 5 figures, the working class woman, the upper and middle class women, the unskilled working class man, or the working classes, the middle classes and the upper classes, the 1832 Reform Act introduced these 2 figures into the political nation, or at least in the political nation had already had this figure involved, but it introduced the middle classes into the political nation. These 3 were still excluded. The 1867 Reform Act introduced some elements of this part of society, the working classes, the skilled and well-paid members of the working classes, but still excluded many, if not most of the working classes, and also women. The 1884 Reform Act introduced the vast majority of the working classes, but refused or failed to introduce any female members of society. And finally, the 1918 Reform Act had that huge change in introducing the rest of the working classes, the 30% of the men who couldn't vote, as well as the vast majority of women who were of a higher class or were married. And that then changes in 1928 when all women are given the vote over the age of 21. And in 1969, all people over the age of 18 are given the right to vote. So this brings us to the question of significance and reminding us of what makes something significant. So we've got those criteria, but let's just think a bit more practically about these particular Reform Acts. The 1832 Reform Act was significant because it was the first official reform. It was an official reform to the voting system, which sought to remove certain old vestiges of the past from our electoral system, notably rotten boroughs, as well as some of the unevenness in the ways in which people voted. But it most notably also introduced a rising middle class to the electorate, so that Parliament was no longer just the institution of the nobility, but also became an institution that was staffed, voted for, and influenced by a new burgeoning middle class who were economically becoming very powerful as well with industrialization. Its lack of significance was clearly found in the fact that it failed to introduce the vote to many working class, all working class people, many of whom had been fighting for the right to vote as part of the movements and political unions that existed in the early 19th century. So they were cut out. Women as well were cut out from that process, despite some women, particularly in the protest of Peterloo, demanding their right to vote and universal suffrage. The 1867 Reform Act was significant because for the first time it actually introduced the right to vote to some working class people, and this had a bigger impact upon the demands that the electorate could make of their government and their focus on providing support for some working class conditions and issues that they faced. But it still locked out the vast majority of working class men, as well as, of course, all women. 1884 is significant as a Reform Act because it did introduce the right to vote to the vast majority, the or 70+% of the working classes. And this has a transformational impact on UK politics, because from now on, the working classes are a big constituency that need to be listened to and need their support, or political parties need their support. And so in 1884, this Reform Act introduces a new type of electorate, a kind of predominantly working class electorate that need to be appealed to. But again, of course, despite demands by many women, women were not given the right to vote in the 1884 Reform Act. And this therefore leads to its significance in 1918, which for the first time ever gives women the right to vote after a famous struggle for the suffragettes and the suffragists to get the right for women to vote. In 1918, they are given, or some women are given, the right to vote. Not all women, but 40% roughly of women are given the right to vote, and all men are over the age of 21. So that 30% who were not given the right to vote by the 1884 Reform Act, 30% of men were now given the right to vote as well. And this has huge impacts upon UK politics as well, because as we see, the rise of the Labour Party comes off the back of this. And really, it's unfathomable to think of the Labour Party as a major party today without the rise of working classes' right to vote, which comes finally with the 1918 Representation of the People Act. So these are reasons why we could say these acts are significant, or potentially their significance is limited. Okay, and you should be doing or taking notes on that within each side of the table on significance and insignificance. And having done that, I want you to really think and go back to that inquiry question, or sorry, that big essay question or title for today's lesson, which is, which Reform Act most significantly altered the political nation? So you need to think here about what it would mean to significantly alter. Which Reform Act, for instance, introduced a new group of people to the political nation? Arguably all of them, but was one of them more significant a move than others? Which Reform Act was the beginning of this process? Which Reform Act kind of triggered later Reform Acts? Which Reform Act had an impact that potentially goes beyond just the right to vote? Which Reform Act brought in new political movements or excited new political movements in the country? These are all things to think about when we're considering significance. And I think finally, you might want to think about this question of this final question of the big questions. By the end of 1918, who holds power in the UK? Is that power now just held by the aristocracy? Is it held by the middle classes? Is it held by the working classes? Is it held by all three? And is the political nation now far different to the one that we begin our course in 1800, or begin our section of the course in 1800 with? Where do our rulers now get the legitimacy from? We saw that divine right died and parliamentary sovereignty rose, but now Parliament is being elected by the vast majority of the people. Is it fair to say that Parliament's ruling legitimacy comes from elections now, from the people? Does legitimacy now emerge from the people? What methods of control are being used by the state now? We're going to have a look at that in the next few lessons. And who challenges the power of the government or the state? Well, the electorate can now challenge the power of political parties who get voted in and out. So that really is where I leave you, because what I want you to now do is complete an essay question, a significance question, on one of the Reform Acts, but I will explain that in a second. And that brings me to the essay question I'd like you to write. How significant was the 1832 Reform Act? It's a significance question, and I want you to consider, obviously, whether G-plot can help you here. But before you even use G-plot or any criteria, I would like you to just think about what you know about the 1832 Reform Act. And three things pop out to me when I think about the 1832 Reform Act and its significance. I want to think about, did it impact the whole population? Did it have an impact upon every single English person or British person at the time? Or did it have a more limited impact? Was it a lasting impact? Did that reform change? And did that change ultimately remain instantiated for years to come? Or did they eventually, the political nation, have to reform itself again? And if so, does that undermine the significance of the 1832 Reform Act? If so, in what ways? And finally, did it change the way people thought around power? Now, I think this is a more difficult one to argue, but I think really important to consider. If we talk about the Glorious Revolution as not really changing loads, but actually changing the way people thought about power more than anything else, this is a really, really important thing to think about with the 1832 Reform Act, because maybe it didn't impact the whole of the population, but did it bring into force or bring into being a new way of understanding the legitimacy of Parliament, which is to say that Parliament, although it rules through the legitimacy of the public, and the public obviously being limited at that time, but certainly the electorate being the decider of who is in Parliament and who isn't. And also with that, the rise of the House of Commons as the elected chamber, who are deciding and making big decisions in the public, and big decisions as part of the political nation. So I think those are three things that I might want to consider in 3 different paragraphs that I write around this. Give this your best shot. I look forward to reading and marking it.